Welcome as we will be discussing Ruth chapter 1 to 5, the prologue. We will be investigating the events that describe these 5 verses and how they show us their importance to us, that the characters and the main problem of the book. The following lesson will be broken down to how the passage connects to real life. We will read the passage and also how to understand the various parts of the passage and how it applies to us today. Lastly, I will discuss how to present this in 2 different teaching and preaching outlines, the strengths and the challenges in both approaches. In our passage, we see someone who did everything to avoid misfortune, and it still not only encounters them, but their calamity almost gets multiplied. First, they lead to avoid the misfortune in chapter 1. It says that the famine occurred in Bethlehem. Second, misfortunes finds Naomi and her family when her husband dies in verse 3. Third, the misfortune not only comes but is multiplied when her not only her husband, but both of her sons die. You and I both know what it is like to lose, to do everything you can to avoid misfortune, only to have it not only find you, but it finds you over and over again. This is the situation in the book of Ruth, and this is the major problem and theme of the book, and how God is going to reverse the troubles and the calamities that have come upon Naomi. Now we're going to read the passage. Ruth 1:1-5. In the days when judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man of Bethlehem in Judea went to sojourn in the country of Moab. He and his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech. The name of his wife was Naomi, and the name of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were the Ephraimites from Bethlehem in Judea. They went into the country of Moab and remained there, but Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died. She was left with her 2 sons. These took Moabite wives, and the name of one was Orpah, and the name of the other was Ruth. They lived there about 10 years, and both Mahlon and Chilion died, so that the woman was left without her 2 sons and her husband. Ruth presents to us the background and the major themes and plot of the book. You get acquainted with not only the major characters, but themes as well. We find when the events occurred, in the days when judges rule. This is a hint that the events in the book are not the same time of the people who would be reading the book. We see why they left. They left because of a famine in Bethlehem. So that they left to another place to avoid misfortune and a calamity. We also see who left in verse 3. It is Elimelech and Naomi, which in turn that they have 2 sons and 2 daughter-in-laws, Mahlon, Chilion, Orpah, and Ruth. What was very common in ancient times that names either represent who they are or who they should be. And these names present to us a little bit more information, particularly the names of Ruth's children. The names are as follows. Elimelech, which means God's ruler or king. Naomi, kind, pleasant, delightful. And we're going to look a little bit later how this word of her being kind and pleasant is contrary to how she feels God is treating her. God is against her. Mahlon, to feel sick, to be weak. chilion, to come to an end, to fade or to fade away. Right here that we see in the names themselves. These are not common names. Now imagine that you name your child and it's like, hey, weak, come here. Hey, come to an end, come here. We see that there's this difficulty in just the mere names that she names her children. Often we want names that are bright, things that look forward to something greater. These names in no way, shape, or form display a good greater by the way that they name their children. And it's not only Naomi, but the father in ancient times, that they had the task of what is the name. Orpah means top of the head. Ruth, to drink one's full or to be refreshed. What is interesting is the situation in Bethlehem. And Bethlehem means house of bread, and the Ephrathite means to be fruitful. Yet they are experiencing famine. The events that are happening here in the book are contrary to what their names represent. This could be a form of judgment on Israel for disobedience. We do know that during this period of Israel, the time of the judges, they go through this cycle of disobedience, judgment, and obedience, only to go into disobedience, judgment, and obedience. It's a cycle in the time of judges, and this may be what is happening here. Fourth, we see where they went. They went to Moab, an enemy of Israel. Sometimes it will go to places that are not favorable for us, so that we'll experience something better. Now we must remember that they're going to Moab so that they can not feel the calamity of the famine. Lastly, that we see tragedy or the problem of the book and what has happened to Naomi, and we're almost anticipating, how is God going to restore her? How is God going to redeem this horrible situation? You also see in this passage God's providence, which I define as God's providence as God's invisible hand that you cannot see. Now, there are a couple of ways to look at God's sovereignty. Either God is only in control of the good and somehow that he is helpless to the bad, or he causes both good and bad on believers and unbelievers and has no preference whatsoever, or he allows the bad things to happen to believers but has a divine purpose for them, and he causes blessing and favor to the believers. The third option, this last option, is the only answer biblically. But sometimes we may feel that we are a ball of string or some yarn, and it's almost as if God is just patting us away, and God has no good purpose for us. We cannot see we cannot see anything good in these situations. In what God is doing, we must trust God's purposes for our lives, both in the good and the bad. God sees more, infinitely more than we can see, and every step he moves for us is for our good and his glory, even when we cannot see it. Our passage presents questions that cause us to reflect, such as, what would you do if everything you had was taken away? How would you respond? How would you respond if this happened to you? So if you move away from famine, how would you respond? Put yourself into Naomi's shoes. Put yourself into Naomi's shoes and ask yourself, how would I respond? How do you struggle with God's providence when it's not favorable to you? Our passage presents some challenges for us, both from a teaching perspective and a preaching perspective. The challenge is this: how are we going to present this material? Is it purely for understanding? Is it purely for the purpose of application? Or is it a mix between the two? One thing I'm not saying that either is wrong, but what I am saying is that depending on how you plan to deliver the information will depend on how the outline looks. First, now that we're going to get into an outline that is mainly about understanding. If your goal is mainly about understanding, which fits well into a Bible study or Sunday school type lesson, all surrounded around the essential problem and presentation of the book. Now, the same thing can be done in a preaching scenario, but sometimes it may look more like a lecture than a sermon. Not all the time, but this can be done in what's called as a conversational style of preaching. But these are just different ways to present the material. The problem is this. The problem of the book is this. Naomi loses everything, and how is God going to restore her? And as she moves from being God is against her to being God is for her and showing her favor. Therefore, a teaching that fits more of a understanding could look more like this. Why she leaves in verse 1, because of the famine. Who leaves? Elimelech and Naomi. Where do they go? They go in verse 2b. They go to Moab, an enemy of Israel. And lastly, the tragedy and problem of the book in verses 3 and 4. Naomi loses her husband. That's tragedy 1. Naomi loses her children. Tragedy 2. Naomi is left with their wives, which presumably from the book that they have no children. Tragedy 3. The challenge with this type of teaching, the problem with this type of teaching, or the challenge, there's nothing I need to do, and as a result, like I said earlier, it can seem more like a lecture. Now, it can be aided by having dialogue and personal application and reflection questions, but this method of information only does have its inherent difficulties with developing more of a transformative type lesson, because the nature and the purpose is mainly understanding, and the application is left to the hearer. In older generations, this was the typical method of delivery. Almost left all application as the responsibility for the listener, not to the teacher or preacher. I do not necessarily agree with this method, but it has been a method used in the church for centuries, and it has helped and it has edified the church. Now I want to go into how a teaching outline that is can be either a mix between understanding and application, or purely application. This passage is morally geared towards this method. But there's still some challenges. Let me repeat this. One is not right, or the other one is not wrong per se, but if you want to do more of an application, then the outline must look differently and take more of a big picture approach. Let me also start off it also takes a teacher or preacher who probably has a greater depth of experience to do this method, because you're pulling from either your experiences or the ones that you have in common with others. So in order for this method to be effective, you just have to have a more depth of experiences. Outlining this type of teaching or preaching may look something like this. First, God allows misfortune to move us. Now, what I would do here is that my 2 points might look like what it looked like for the passage and what it looks like for me and for you when God moves us away from misfortune. Because I would also get into types of movement. So our book presents a couple types of movement. It has a movement of location, meaning you go from one location to the other. And this is what happens with Ruth and Naomi. Second, relationally. This is primarily with Ruth, though. And spiritually, that the movement that happens in both Naomi and Ruth, as we're going to get into more later, that there is a spiritual movement that happens seemingly first with Ruth and then Naomi. God allows misfortune to move us. Second, I would highlight what happened. So how it happened in the passage. So in the passage, what caused the movement of Naomi and Ruth is because of the death of their husbands, Naomi's husband, Naomi and her children. And then I would shift into probably what does this look like when God moves us from one place to the next. It almost seems like in this passage, God moves them away from Bethlehem, only to move them back to Bethlehem later. Now, this would go counterintuitive to what many of us are taught, that if God moves you away from something, that he would never move you back. And in here that we see in this passage, that God moved them away from Bethlehem only to move them back later. God has his purposes and his plans on why he does this. He allows misfortune, in this last one, he allows misfortune to accomplish his plan. I would highlight, well, once again, shifting from the text and also our lives. So I would show, how did his redemptive plan work? How did their move help to accomplish his redemptive plan for both Ruth and Naomi and his overall purposes? I would also highlight, like going back and forth from the text to us, and how God may use calamity to push us to places that we never thought that we would go. In conclusion, this passage presents with us the major characters and the problem of the book, and how you present this passage. Your goal will ultimately determine your outline, whether that's mainly for understanding or mainly for application. Both have a place and purpose. I will continue to explain each passage from an expositional and topical perspective, helping you to get a greater, richer understanding of this book. I will see you later. You have a wonderful day.